Judas never betrayed Jesus. What if the story was wrong? Judas has always been remembered as the traitor, the name associated with the inevitable downfall. But what if the story had never been so simple? This narrative begins before the coin, before the kiss, when silent choices weigh more than public acts. Perhaps Judas didn't betray Jesus, but fulfilled a role that no one ever wanted to understand. For centuries, Judas has been reduced to a single act, as if his entire existence could be explained by a betrayal. But what if that act wasn't motivated by greed or hatred? What if Judas was convinced he was obeying, not betraying? Looking more closely at the events, an uncomfortable hypothesis emerges. Perhaps the real conflict lies not between loyalty and betrayal, but between understanding and judgment. In the end, the revelation neither absolves nor condemns easily, only forcing us to confront a disturbing question. What if Judas never believed he was betraying Jesus, but merely fulfilling what he considered inevitable? The story of Judas begins long before the Last Supper and goes far beyond the image of the traitor crystallized over the centuries. He was called like the others, walked with Jesus, heard teachings, and witnessed signs that few saw. Judas does not emerge as a villain, but as someone attentive, rational, and deeply involved with the idea that something greater was underway. While many expected immediate comfort or salvation, he sought to understand the ultimate purpose. This search puts him in constant tension because Judas does not accept meaningless mystery. He observes, calculates, and tries to anticipate the outcome. It is at this point that his story differs, not because of evident wickedness, but because of a disturbing need to make sense of what seemed inevitable. As the ministry progresses, Judas begins to perceive a growing contrast between expectation and reality. He expected direct action, visible change, immediate rupture. Instead, he sees Jesus speak of surrender, loss, and paths that don't seem to lead to political or social victory. Judas doesn't distance himself, but begins to interpret everything through a different lens. Perhaps the confrontation needs to be provoked. Perhaps the revelation depends on an inevitable clash. This logic doesn't stem from betrayal, but from the attempt to accelerate a destiny he believes is already written. While the other disciples follow the path of trust, Judas follows the path of interpretation. He remains close, but internally he is already walking on different ground, where faith and strategy begin to dangerously intertwine, preparing decisions he still believes are necessary. When the possibility of betrayal arises, Judas doesn't see it as a moral rupture, but as a catalyst. He believes that placing Jesus before the authorities would force a definitive revelation, a clear manifestation of power or purpose. In his mind, nothing would get out of control, because everything was already foreseen. The error lies not in the conscious intention to harm, but in the presumption of fully understanding a plan that doesn't belong to him. Judas begins to act convinced that he is serving something greater, even when his actions begin to silently isolate him from others. He keeps the conflict to himself, because admitting doubt would mean admitting that he might be wrong. Thus, the decision is formed not as a deliberate betrayal, but as a rationalized act, where faith gives way to the human need for control. When Judas finally acts, he does so with silent conviction. There is no explicit hatred nor hidden pleasure, only the feeling of pushing history in the direction it inevitably would go. The kiss is not a gesture of contempt, but of final identification, a sign that ends the inner doubt. In the next instant, something breaks. Judas realizes that reality does not react as he imagined. There is no immediate revelation, no visible divine intervention, only imprisonment, silence, and voluntary submission. It is at this moment that the security built on arguments begins to crumble. Judas understands that he confused understanding with obedience and action with fidelity. The plan he believed he understood moves forward without needing him, leaving behind a man confronted by the distance between intention and consequence. After his arrest, Judas is consumed by a disquiet that no logic can silence. He observes from afar, still waiting for an outcome that justifies his choice, but each new event deepens the weight on his chest. Jesus does not resist. does not defend himself, does not try to escape. This passivity destroys the narrative that Judas constructed for himself. For the first time, the possibility arises that he did not accelerate the plan, but interfered with it. Certainty gives way to guilt, not because he recognizes himself as a traitor, but because he realizes he acted without understanding. Judas begins to understand that faith is not about anticipating the end, but about remaining faithful even when the path seems illogical. This realization comes too late, transforming conviction into silent regret. As the trial approaches, Judas feels the weight of each step he has taken. He tries to return the coins, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a desperate attempt to undo a choice he now sees differently. The money loses all meaning in the face of the awareness that certain decisions cannot be reversed. Judas does not run from his mistake. He confronts it, and this sets him apart from the simplistic image that time has constructed. His suffering stems not only from guilt, but from the recognition that he confused purpose with certainty. He discovers too late that not every well-intentioned action is born of true faith. As events unfold, Judas realizes that Jesus' silence was not weakness, but absolute fidelity to a plan that never needed to be enforced. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Isolated and misunderstood, Judas becomes a prisoner of his own conscience. He realizes that his greatest failure was not acting, but assuming a role that was never entrusted to him. In trying to control the outcome, he lost the ability to trust. Every memory alongside Jesus now returns with a different meaning, as if the words that once seemed enigmatic have become clear too late. Judas understands that faith demands neither proof nor haste, only surrender. The weight of this revelation finds no relief because there is no longer time to repair, only to acknowledge. His silence begins to echo louder than any external accusation. As events unfold, the figure of Judas begins to disappear from the accounts, but not from history. He is no longer observed, no longer heard, only remembered for his final act. However, within him, understanding matures painfully. Judas realizes that Jesus never needed to be pushed to fulfill his destiny, because he walked voluntarily towards it. This awareness transforms Judas's internal narrative, not into absolution, but into clarity. He understands that divine freedom does not submit to human anxiety. By trying to anticipate the end, he strayed from the path. His absence becomes a silent reminder that not all proximity guarantees understanding. Judas's repentance finds no stage or witnesses, only solitude. Unlike repentance that seeks immediate forgiveness, his is born from the profound recognition of a limit crossed. He does not see himself as a villain, but as someone who failed by trying to help in the wrong way. This nuance is lost over time, replaced by simpler labels. Judas comes to carry the awareness that intentions do not protect against consequences. His story becomes a silent warning about the danger of acting in God's name without listening to God. The real conflict was not between good and evil, but between trust and control. This tension remains as an invisible legacy of his choice. What happened next was recorded briefly, almost hastily, as if the world didn't want to linger too long looking at Judas. But perhaps the point isn't how he ended up, but rather what his story reveals. Judas wasn't just the traitor that tradition crystallized, but a reflection of a universal human temptation, believing we understand better than we should. His trajectory questions to what extent faith and haste can coexist. By reimagining Judas without the caricature, the narrative becomes more uncomfortable because it exposes something unsettling. Sometimes the greatest mistake doesn't stem from malice, but from an excessive certainty of doing the right thing. From this point on, the story ceases to be solely about Judas and begins to reflect on all who hear it. His choice echoes like an unsettling mirror, showing the risk of transforming faith into calculation and devotion into strategy. Judas believed he was collaborating with the divine plan, but ended up revealing the human limit of interpreting what has not been revealed. The silence surrounding his end contrasts with the lasting impact of his act, which continues to be debated, judged, and reinterpreted. He becomes a symbol not only of failure but of warning. Not every action driven by conviction stems from true obedience, and not every closeness guarantees a real understanding of the greater purpose. Over time, the figure of Judas has been used to simplify a story that was never simple. His name becomes synonymous with betrayal, erasing nuances, doubts, and internal conflicts. This reduction serves to ease the collective conscience because it is easier to condemn than to understand. However, looking deeper, Judas represents the danger of a faith that cannot bear to wait. He wanted results, proof, immediate manifestations. By not tolerating the rhythm of mystery, he broke the balance between trusting and acting. His story remains a silent warning that trying to help God can be more dangerous than simply following him, especially when haste replaces listening. Revisiting this alternative narrative raises a question that spans generations. How often does the intention to do good end up producing the opposite? Judas doesn't fall due to a lack of declared faith, but due to an excess of personal certainty. He believed he understood the timing, the method, and the outcome. This conviction distanced him from the humility necessary to trust without interfering. His story provokes discomfort because it is not limited to the biblical past. It repeats itself whenever someone decides to act in the name of a greater purpose without accepting its limitations. Judas thus becomes a living warning that the line between devotion and presumption is more fragile than it seems, and crossing it can cost everything. In the end, Judas's story was never just about betrayal but about human frailty in the face of mystery. He walked close, heard eternal words, and yet tried to control the uncontrollable. By imagining he understood the plan, he lost the essence of faith, which doesn't require complete understanding, only trust. This reinterpretation doesn't seek to absolve or condemn, but to provoke reflection. Judas remains an uncomfortable reminder that being close to the truth doesn't guarantee living it fully. His legacy is not the kiss nor the coins, but the question that echoes to this day. How many times do we confuse certainty with fidelity and end up distancing ourselves from precisely what we claim to follow? If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story.